Hello everyone, it's good to have you with us for episode 8 in our series in the letter to the Hebrews. Our passage for today is a long one, Hebrews 8:1 through to 10:18. It's an important passage and there's a great deal of detail in it, and I hope you'll take time after today's episode to read it again in the light of what we say and to think about it perhaps in a little bit more detail. What I want to do today is just to focus your attention on what we might call the central theme or the key idea of this long section of the letter. I think we see that key idea in chapter 8 and verse 6. So let me read it for you. I'm reading from the ESV, the English Standard Version. But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is much more excellent than the old, as much more excellent, that is, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. So do you see the point? Because Jesus' ministry is better than the ministry of the other priests who we've looked at before, the covenant that he mediates is a better covenant because it's based on better promises. So the old covenant was mediated by Moses. The new covenant mediated by Jesus is much more excellent, to use the words of the ESV in verse 6. Now, throughout this whole section, our author is really arguing that one point. And he does it in a number of ways, and I just want to highlight some of them so that when you work through this for yourself, you'll be able to follow his logic. First of all, he makes the point that this covenant is better, superior, by showing that the place in which Jesus serves, that is the heavenly tabernacle, the Holy of Holies, in the presence of God, is in fact far better than where the earthly priests served. In fact, he uses the language of shadow and copy to describe the earthly tabernacle, chapter 8, verse 5. They serve at a copy or a shadow of the heavenly things. Do you see that, 8:5? So the old covenant took place through priests bringing sacrifices in a holy place, a tabernacle, and all of this was but a shadow or a copy of the heavenly reality. The old covenant, therefore, is inferior to the new because the place of service was on earth, a shadow of the heavenly reality, which is the true holy place. So 8 verse 4 to 5, and again in chapter 9 verse 1 to verse 10, where he describes the practice of these priests in the earthly tabernacle, the main point he's making is they served at the tent that was a copy of the heavenly reality. But what is true of Christ? Well, chapter 9, verse 11 and verse 12, when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that are to come, he went through the greater and more perfect tent, that is the heavenly place, not made with hands, that is not of this creation. He entered once for all, verse 12 of chapter 9, into the holy places, that is into God's very presence. You see his point? The covenant that Jesus brings is better because the place in which it was enacted is in the heavens rather than bound to the earthly tabernacle. The second way he shows that the covenant is better or more excellent is because he tells us that the sacrifice associated with this covenant is a far more excellent or a far better sacrifice. Chapter 9, verse 9. Listen to what he says. Talking about the covenant on earth, carried out by the priests. Basically, he speaks about the fact that the offerings and the sacrifices that they brought, 9 verse 9, cannot perfect the conscience of the worshipper. Do you see that? It cannot perfect the conscience of the worshipper. And why is that? Well, chapter 10 verse 4, because this ritual, this sacrifice offered was in the blood of bulls and goats, and chapter 10 verse 4 tells us that it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. I know we're jumping around in the passage. Remember, what we're trying to do is we're trying to follow the logic. So it was in the blood of bulls and goats. We know that from Leviticus. And the point is that the blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sins. And therefore, the offerings of this blood in the holy place on earth was unable to cleanse the conscience. Because the sins aren't taken away, the conscience can't be cleansed. And that's why these priests, chapter 10, verse 2 to verse 3, had to keep doing the ritual of sacrifice year in and year out. That's the point he's making. If it was sufficient, it would have ceased to have been offered. But as it is, they keep on offering this as a reminder of sins every year, chapter 10, verse 3. See the point? In the earthly ritual, the offerings and the sacrifices, though they were God-given and symbolic shadows of the reality, could not actually deal with sin. What is true, though, of Jesus? When Christ comes, chapter 9, verse 26, we have this extraordinary and wonderful statement. When Christ appears once for all at the end of the age, what does he do? He suffers not repeatedly, but once to put an end to sin. Isn't that an extraordinary statement? He comes at the end of the ages, chapter 9, verse 26, and he puts away sin. He deals with sin once and for all through the sacrifice of himself. And for that reason, chapter 9, verse 4, just jumping back now, he's able to cleanse the conscience. So, what an extraordinary thing. Because he is able to deal with sins, he is able to cleanse the conscience of the worshipper. What an amazing sacrifice that Jesus brings. Because of his perfection, because he is the Son of God without sin, because he is our great high priest, and he has entered the world as the high priest sent by God to deal with sin once and for all, when his death is completed and sin is paid for, we can now enter the holy place. We'll see that as the letter moves forward. And we can go to God with a cleansed conscience. The covenant sealed in blood is much better. The covenant that Jesus brings, the new covenant, is far better than the covenant that Moses brought. That's the main point of this whole passage. Now, just as we finish, I want you to notice one third thing. In chapter 8, verse 8, we have a quote from Jeremiah 31 following. So in 8:8 through to verse 12, he quotes extensively from Jeremiah chapter 31. If we turn to the end of our passage, we see verse 16 of chapter 10, he quotes again from Jeremiah chapter 31. In other words, the writer uses Jeremiah 31 to bracket this material, just as we've seen before, use Psalm 2 and Psalm 110 to bracket material. Jeremiah 31 is the place in which God himself speaks about the fact that the old covenant would be replaced by a new covenant. And here's the key thing. The key thing about the new covenant is, number one, that it will deal with sins properly once and for all. And number two, through the new covenant, the law of God will be written on our hearts. And so by bracketing all this material with Jeremiah 31, what is the writer saying to us? He's saying to us that the covenant in Jesus is a far better covenant than the old covenant, because it is bringing a better sacrifice from a perfect priest who serves not in the earthly shadow but in the heavenly reality. But he's also telling us that this was always God's plan, that God sent Jesus to fulfill his promise and his plan, that the time would come when the old covenant would give way to a new covenant, which is far, far better, where sins are actually dealt with and where the law of God is written on our hearts, so that we are now free to worship God with a clear conscience. A lot of material, some tight logic. Please read the passage again. But I think when you do, and as you think about it in the light of what I've said today, you will, I hope, come away with this one conviction, that it is far, far better thing to belong to Jesus and the covenant that he mediates than to cling to any kind of religious form at all, no matter how good it might have been in the past. Thanks so much for joining me today. We look forward to seeing you for our next episode.